So slide number 2 here says addressing limiting factors, general principle and objective. Life will do the best with what she has. This is, I think I made this point earlier. I mean, it's about life as far as I'm concerned and identifying what's not present and addressing it. And the idea is you don't need to understand everything. You just need to understand what you can do to help and then get out of the way. Identify limiting factors and endeavor to address them. I've got minerals, biology, carbon, water, and air. I talked about that before the break. These are the critical environmental conditions I think are necessary. Obviously, warmth is necessary. Obviously, sunlight is necessary. I'm going to assume people understand that if you are planting a garden on the north side of a big tree, it's not going to grow well. Yeah? Everybody knows about that. If you have a backyard that's not very big and you can't control the trees that are on your neighbor's property, that's on the south side of your property, then you're screwed. Right? No sunlight means things don't grow very well. So, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to let that be there. These are more, I think, nuanced points. Life is the objective. Supporting and empowering soil life is the key to healthy plants. I think I talked about that. Things that you do or let be done that harm soil life, harm your plants, like letting your soil dry out, is something that you do that harms your soil life and then therefore harms your plants. Quality is the objective. Nutrient level that correlates with flavor and aroma and shelf life. I did talk about that. Correlates with pest and disease resistance, correlates with carbon sequestration. People are familiar with the basic numbers on carbon in the atmosphere. There's a little over 400 parts per million of CO2 now. There were 280 in 1750. Everybody's okay with that? Roughly? Those who are following the numbers? Ballpark. 250 years, 120 parts per million increase in CO2. As I understand it, at least 40% of that carbon that's been added to the atmosphere came from the soil. Did not come from burning coal and oil and natural gas. It came from burning soil. The process of tilling soil and leaving it exposed to sunlight is a process of oxidation, whereby the organic matter is turned into carbon dioxide and goes up. The process of adding salt fertilizer is a process of burning off organic matter, turning it basically into carbon dioxide, and it goes up into the atmosphere. Anybody ever brought in, built a proper, with walls, raised bed, brought soil in, quote unquote soil in the back of a truck, filled that bed up, and then found next year that it wasn't full anymore, and wondered where that soil went? For starters, it wasn't soil, but that's a different conversation. It went up. That compost, that not stable organic matter, oxidized and turned into carbon dioxide. So 40% at least of the carbon that's been added to the atmosphere since 1750 came from the soil, did not come from burning hydrocarbons. Factoid, look it up, detail, deal with it. There are farmers on this planet who are operating farms in the thousands of acres scale, 5,000 acres, 10,000 acres, 20,000 acres scale, who are systemically increasing organic matter at rates of something along the lines of 0.5% per year. 1.5 to 2, 2 to 2.5, 2.5 to 3, 3 to 3.5, 3.5 to 4, 4 to 4.5, 4.5 to 5, year after year after year. There are something like, at least 7 billion acres of agricultural land on this planet. Some people would say 10, some people say 13, depends on whether you count rangelands and all that kind of stuff. We'll say 7. The amount of carbon dioxide in 0.5% organic matter times 7 billion acres of agricultural land equals 15 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. What does that mean? That means if agriculture was being performed well, if people were growing healthy plants, we could go from 400 ppm of CO2 in the atmosphere this year to, just in agriculture, not forestry or lawns or anything else, just farms, 400 to 385 in 1 year. 385 to 370, 370 to 355, 355 to 340. It would take us about 8 years to get back to where we were in 1750, if we were to practice agriculture well. Minor point. These guys are not adding compost. They're not mulching. 5,000 acres, you don't add compost, right? You're not mulching 20,000 acres of cropland. They're growing soil by creating an environment where the plants are making sugar through photosynthesis and injecting it into the soil to feed the soil life. It is no more complicated than that. That's where the 40 feet of topsoil in Illinois came from.
These are tilled crop farmers you're talking about.
So Gabe Brown is one example who's doing, his pastured beef. The 20,000 acre guy is doing, he's doing a mix of pasture and grains in Australia.
Oh,
He's
okay.
running his sheep
Like
through.
pasture cropping.
He's running his sheep through and then drilling in grain, and then harvesting his oats and then running the sheep through. So he's making tons of money, growing grain on scale, and meat. It actually is more economically viable for you to work in harmony with life. Your cost of production goes down, your yields go up, you're getting multiple crops, your resilience to climatic irregularities dramatically increases. This is all beautifully interrelated, right? The science is not like soft on this. We can do this. This is totally possible. I suggest this is not necessarily, even though it's possible, that's not enough of an incentive to get it to happen. People need much more visceral drivers than for the greater good, I think. I've become cynical in my old age. Anyway, we'll talk about that later, what more visceral drivers are. But the idea here is that if we do agriculture well, we can deal with these problems systemically and rapidly. So don't get all worked up and depressed about things going to pot. See it as an opportunity. The worse things get, the more people are willing to open their minds and do things differently. I think this is an amazing time, amazing opportunity. When things are falling apart everywhere, people are really open. They're really open to other ideas. There's a suggestion here, there's a correlation between soil health and plant health, between plant health and human health, between human health and cultural and environmental health. I've made that, I'll make that point throughout, but those are general sort of foundational points. Topics for today: soil testing and mineral balancing, cover cropping, mulching, inoculation, potting soil, tillage, fertigation, irrigation, foliar spraying. The idea here is this is a 2-day course. Ideally, day 1 was fall. We do it in the fall, and it would be fall and winter topics, and then day 2 would be in the early spring, and it would be spring and summer topics. So we'll be talking about plant visual analysis and planting and transplanting and seed starting and conductivity and bricks and all that kind of stuff tomorrow. Today we're talking about more systemic infrastructure management and principles and things. So I'm gonna work down here from the top, and then we can just make sure everybody's on the same page with what these words mean. Sample depth in inches. The assumption is that you're taking your soil tests, set a 6-inch deep core of the soil. The assumption is that there's a 6-inch deep aerobic zone, which is where the soil life is flourishing, which is where the plants are getting their nutrients from, and that's why soil tests are assumed to be. They presume you do a 6-inch deep core. If you don't do something, if you don't say differently, that's what they're going to assume. Yes.
Which type of soil test analysis was this one?
This is an Albrecht style soil test, which is not what you're going to get at, is it NC State? Who do you guys go to? Clemson?
Yeah.
Right? They're going to be doing what's called a SLAN analysis, sufficient level of available nutrients. So Albrecht was kicking butt, getting amazing results, training all kinds of students who were getting professorships in other universities around the country. This is the 40s, late 40s, early 50s. After World War II, the armaments industry had a surfeit of manufacturing capacity. They had the factories to build lots of chemical weapons and no market for their chemical weapons. They had the factories to build lots of explosives, but no market for all their explosives. And they said, who can we sell this stuff to? Who needs large quantities of these materials on an annual basis? Who can we figure out? And they identified farmers as a market. So they took the chemical weapons, they changed the label, and sold them to the farmers and called them insecticides. So now, we spray our land with chemical weapons. Literally changed the label. Didn't change the recipe. Nerve gas. Now, still nerve gas, different label. Look it up. Look it up. The explosives, the ingredients in explosives. Remember the Oklahoma City bombing? That was a fertilizer bomb, right? Because the ingredients in explosives are what we now call fertilizer. They took those same materials and sold them to farmers. They also took money and gave it to universities and said, we will endow this chair if you fire that guy. And they went through and they basically took out Albrecht and all of his students. Look this up. What we call conventional ag, only happened after World War II. The salt fertilizers, soluble fertilizers, chemical weapons strategy came out of the war effort, the war machine. And we've seen now with a couple generations of humans, what the effect is on our culture, on our health, on our intelligence, on our landscape. So anyway, most of the land-grant universities are down this particular rabbit hole. They're going to be recommending nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. They do not understand Albrecht. They haven't heard of Albrecht. They've heard to disrespect Albrecht if they've heard of him. So I personally suggest, well, I'll just say, if you take your local land-grant university soil report, what I'm teaching you does not work. It's different languages. It's like Latin and French. They may look like the same word, but it's not. We did this experiment in Massachusetts a couple of years ago where a farmer took a soil test, sent half of it to an Albrecht lab, half of it to UMass. They both claimed to be doing phosphorus in Malic 3, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Malic 3 phosphorus was how they report. There's lots of different ways of testing phosphorus. UMass came back saying, I think it was 6 parts per million of Malic 3 phosphorus, and Logan came back saying 150. That's not like 15, 20% variation, like a lab error or whatever, right? Everybody can do their math? 2,500% variation between 6 and 100, like, that's a big variation. The university assumes that, well, so let me put it this way. Phosphorus in biological systems is made available very well by mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi don't do well when fungicides are being applied and tillage is occurring. And so in conventional systems, there's not much mycorrhizal fungi. So the land grant understands that most of the phosphorus that's present is not available in their reality. And so when they get a report, they have an algorithm which basically removes 98% of the phosphorus because 98% of it's not available. So they report to you how much they think is going to be available in your conventionally managed system. Does that make sense? Totally logical, totally justifiable, and presuming a certain kind of reality. If you don't want to presume that reality, if you want to presume a different reality, then you need to engage in a different dynamic. So this is a report from Logan Lab. You can see here there are a few labs across the country which are Albrecht-style labs. There's A&L labs, which I think just got changed to Waypoint, somebody told me recently. There's Midwest Lab, there's Kinsey Lab, there's Logan Lab, there's some good ones around the country. If you go to our organizational website, you will find a link to this Logan Lab report because it gives you way more elements for less money than I can find anywhere else. Not because they're better necessarily, just because they can get, there's a deal I have gotten my hands on. So sample depth in inches, 6 inches, what's that?
I'm just a little confused because we've done tests with NC State and A&L just to see what the differences were, and there weren't those huge differences. There were differences, but there weren't like 2,000% differences. So is there a way that they're registering more of our stuff because of what we're doing at NC State? I mean, we weren't seeing anywhere near that swing in phosphorus, for example.
I know only enough about soil tests to know that every single one is different. And there is anybody who's ever tried to study soil tests and methodologies, and like, are we going to use a Bray analysis or an Albrecht analysis or a Morgan, modified Morgan? Like, it is this massive rabbit hole of like slop and mud where it's, I don't know the answer. All I know is I don't know enough.
Well, yeah,
I know enough to know I don't really.
I've seen NC State being wildly different.
You just said they weren't wildly different.
No. A&L and NC State, we've tested them, we just to learn about the labs, we've taken the same soil samples and sent them to both.
Yeah.
And there were differences for sure, but they weren't like 2,000% differences. But I can also add to what you're saying and saying that NC State at least has like given me wildly different results. I mean, within the course of a year and a half, had my pH be between, 6 and 7.5, things like that. So I know there are variations even within the system.
Yeah.
But I was interested because we didn't have those kind of swings, and A&L.
A&L is an Albrecht.
Private lab.
Yeah. I'm going to teach you how to read an Albrecht style report. And if you send your soil to a university, don't think that what I'm teaching you is appropriate for that report. They're different languages, and this is I'm going to be teaching you this basic language. That's the basic point I want to make. Sample depth 6 inches, I explained that. The basic way you take a soil test is you want to get the same amount of soil from the top inch, second inch, third inch, fourth inch, fifth inch, and sixth inch. You want to get multiple samples from across the growing area, 5 or 6 at least, generally. Mix them all up in a bucket, put it into, take a cup out, put it in a Ziploc bag, fill out the form, send it in. Not a complicated process. This report costs $30. Exchange capacity is the next line here. Just quick. What is exchange capacity for those who don't know? People may have seen the classic sand, silt, and clay, picture in some book they read about soil. Here's your sand particles. Here's your clay particles. You've seen this one? Sort of. No, but I get it. All right, so the idea here basically is that there are these things called bonding sites where the minerals that are taken up by the plant are attached. So calcium, potassium, magnesium, copper, zinc, etc. They're attached to these electrons that are sticking out of the soil, colloid. Etc. So the basic point of exchange capacity is different soils have different amounts of surface area. A sandy soil has less surface area per unit volume than a clayey soil, which means it has less bonding sites, which means it can hold less nutrients. I like to use the metaphor of a gas tank. Anybody ever driven an F-350? Big old pickup truck? Until the gas tank ran out. And then you take it to the gas station and it took a while to fill it up. Right? Good solid 30 gallons to fill that baby up. Anybody ever driven a motorcycle? Till the gas tank wore out, emptied out? Go to the gas station to fill it up. You put 30 gallons into a motorcycle gas tank and you're going to get 29 gallons on the ground. Right? The size of the tank is foundationally different. The size of the tank in a sandy soil is foundationally different than the size of a tank in a clayey soil. This is what exchange capacity is basically telling you, is how big is your tank? What's the capacity of your soil to produce crops? In the Midwest, they'll say a exchange capacity of 5 equals a 50 bushel per acre yield potential. Exchange capacity of 10 equals 100 bushel per acre yield potential, etc. The X factor in all this, of course, is always organic matter, humus. Good, solid, stable organic matter has way more surface area per unit volume than clay. Will hold 4 times its weight in water, facilitates flocculation, keeps, so regardless of what your exchange capacity is, you always want it to be building organic matter, as far as I'm concerned, is always a systemic accomplishment or value. When I look at the soils around here, I see red in most places. I take that to mean not a lot of organic matter. I'm going to assume that is going to be a limiting factor in a lot of people's environmental conditions is the difficulty in actually systemically building organic matter over time in your soil. Okay, that's basically exchange capacity. Next thing here is pH. I really want to talk about pH because I think a lot of people have misconceptions when it comes to pH. pH is the inverse logarithm of the hydronium to hydroxyl ion. So what does that mean in English? Everybody's heard about this compound? Seen that one before? Yeah. So we're taught in school about this compound as a concept. Where in reality do you find one molecule of water? Maybe, right? Rarely, but we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. My understanding is generally you find multiple molecules of water in relationship to each other. One drop of water has who knows how many million molecules. They say water is bipolar. Anybody heard this one? Yeah. There's an OH minus, OH plus? H plus. OH minus. I had that wrong. I like to think of water as perhaps polyamorous. I think it's a better way to... Finally, somebody! It's got to be somewhere in nature. I always thought it was the right way to do things. Sometimes this H is hanging out with this OH over here, and sometimes this H is hanging out with this SOH over here, right? In one molecule of water, you got a couple million, in one drop of water, you got a couple million molecules of water. They're not stably attached, right? The HOH is not like fixed together. It's a very loose affiliation, and it's constantly shifting and modulating. And like a game of musical chairs, there's not usually exactly as many H's as there are OH's. There's usually more H's or more OH's. So somebody's left holding the bag. So pH, technically, the inverse logarithm of the hydronium to the hydroxyl ions, pH of 7 means there's 1 H for every 1 OH. pH of 6 means there's 10 H's for every 1 OH. It's a logarithmic scale, like the Richter scale. An earthquake that's a 4 is 10 times stronger than an earthquake that's a 3. pH of 5 means there's 100 H's for every 1 OH. pH of 8 means there's 1 H for every 10 OH's, right? It just, see how that works? 7's the middle. This is technically, as I understand it, what pH actually is. Where's the limestone in this equation?
Limestone?
Don't they tell you to add limestone when you get low pH?
What's high?
When you've got a pH of 5,
Yeah, lime.
add lime. Where is the limestone in this equation? There's no limestone in this equation. The point is, why do we think pH is important?
Take up nutrients.
What is it?
Nutrient uptake.
Nutrient availability, we are taught, is connected to pH in the soil. This is the science. In a test tube, this is a test tube full of water. If you put a piece of copper in it, based on the pH of the water, the copper will become more or less soluble. In this zone right here, the 6.4 to 6.8 zone, copper is most soluble. In a test tube, 100% true, every single time. We're making decisions about soil based on what's true in a test tube. There's a little thing called life missing in the test tube. This is chemistry set. This is not life. We are making our agronomic decisions about how we treat our soil based on what's true in a test tube. I would suggest there is a minor issue here. The issue is that in a root, right, I drilled the root out before, get this rhizosphere, this area surrounding the root. If you put a pH meter in the rhizosphere and you leave it there for a day, you can watch the pH go from 5 up to 7 and back down to 5 in that spot in that day. Because what bacteria and fungi do is exude acids and bases to raise and lower the pH to solubilize the nutrients that are needed by the plant in real time. pH is not a static factor. If pH is static in your soil is dead. In the rhizosphere, pH is going up and down all day long based on what the plant needs, based on the environmental conditions. It's true that copper and zinc and calcium are most soluble at this pH, but phosphorus isn't. Right? Different nutrients are solubilized at different pHs, and that's why we have different soil life that have different faculties and capacities. So I suggest that pH is a following factor of biological activity, and I could give a rat's rear end about what the pH is in my soil. I don't know, I don't care, literally. What I care about is whether I have the basic level of elements present, and air and water and food and life for the biological system to function. My understanding is when I do get those elements present, soil life will take care of the pH for me. What does a low pH soil mean? We talked about a low pH means lots of hydrogens. Where do those hydrogens come from? I left this clay piece here, and I drew some calcium and some potassium and magnesium and rough scribble you probably can't read. What happens when the soil life comes and solubilizes, pulls off a copper off of the soil, colloid, the copper goes out. They don't leave this electron hanging loose. They stick somebody in there called a hydrogen. So when the soil life and the plants have harvested out most of the nutrients out of the soil, they've left a bunch of hydrogens. So a low pH soil is an empty tank. Does that make sense to anybody? Yeah. So you can fill your tank with straight calcium, but you actually need other things in the tank too. A low pH means the tank is empty, but it's not telling you specifically what it's empty of. And just filling it all the way up with calcium and not putting other things in there is going to give your plants, indigestion functionally. They're not going to have the full spectrum of nutrients they need to flourish. So that's why I recommend taking a soil test, looking at all these different nutrients and addressing them all systemically based on what Albrecht figured out, which is a segue back to the handout. On the top of page 2, I've got target levels of macrominerals, target levels of trace elements. As we go through the process of reading the soil test and making recommendations, this is going to be what I'm going to ask you to work with as far as your targets. This has been put together following Albrecht's work by his students, people who are agronomists and have been for 30 years, 40 years in the Midwest, working with lots of farms. I basically went around and talked to all the elders 10 years ago when I started learning about all this stuff and said, hey guys, can you please help me figure out a common target list to work with? Because Jerry, you're saying this, and Gary, you're saying that, and Arden, you're saying this over here, and Bruce, can you guys just agree on something? So I went around and surveyed them all and said, Bruce says this, Jerry says this, what do you say about that? And it took like 3 cycles around before I got them all to agree on a basic set of targets. So that's what we've got here is the collected wisdom from the elders in the Albrecht community about what the target levels are. So refer back to that when we get to that level of the handout in the process. Conversions. I'm going to be teaching you how to make recommendations for, say, 500 pounds of gypsum per acre or 10 pounds of copper sulfate per acre. And not everyone here is working on an acreage basis. So I've got some real simple ones like 500 pounds per acre equals 11.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet, which would be 1.15 pounds per 100 square feet. So you need to figure out basically how big your garden is. But we've got some conversions there for you to deal with later if you want to engage this process. So in the same way that many people feel a responsibility to identify what it is they're putting into their bodies because they understand what they put into their bodies affects who they are. I would say we have a responsibility to understand what we're putting into our soil. And this is not the kind of thing that should be outsourced to someone else whose perspective you may not trust. Some specialist who may be trained in a reality that you don't agree with. I would suggest learning how to understand what your soil needs and taking responsibility for that is a valuable skill. Something about fishing. We heard the fishing one. Giving fish, teaching to fish, something. Yeah, I would suggest this is a skill we should have. We should take ownership of identifying what our soil needs and not let somebody else do that. So in this process, there's one key piece of information that consultants have that you don't have. When you get a soil report back, you'll get your soil report back in parts per million. It'll say, 14 parts per million sulfur, 250 parts per million, magnesium or whatever. And generally when you put sulfur down in your field, you put it down in pounds per acre. So foundationally, the only real piece of information you need is how do you convert from parts per million to pounds per acre, because everything else is pretty simple math. This is the big secret. Everybody ready for it? Parts per million times 2 equals pounds per acre. Sorry if that was anticlimactic. It's just that easy. The target level of sulfur is 75 parts per million times 2 equals 150 pounds per acre. Nothing too complicated yet. The soil report in his old garden says he has how much sulfur? Everybody found that? If you can't find it, ask your neighbor where it is. 14 parts per million times 2 equals 28 pounds per acre. Anybody want to guess what the next process is?
Subtraction.
Ooh, haha. $122 pounds per acre of sulfur needed. Anybody overwhelmed yet? I don't think this is a very complicated process. Making recommendations on a soil test is something that I'm pretty sure everybody in here has the capacity to do. You may not want to, that's fine, but it's, I like to leave people with that skill. So this is not the final answer because you never find any element in its pure form. You never find pure sulfur, you never find pure calcium, you never find pure copper, so you got to figure out what the product is that you're using to address this deficiency. I'll just say theoretically we're going to use elemental sulfur, and that has a 90% concentration of sulfur. So there is some high math here coming up right now. I usually, the way I do things is with the back of the envelope, in my head math, and I used to teach this course that way, and then half the people were fine with it, the other half of people didn't. They're just sort of mathophobic and they need an equation. So I'm going to give you an equation to actually get this one to the next level. So basically it's the pounds of the element needed divided by the percent concentration in the product. And you'll see as we go through the handout that I've got the percent concentrations and a bunch of sort of typical products all laid out for you. In this case, pounds of element needed is 122. The percent concentration in 90% sulfur is 90%, which is written 0.9. The percent concentration. So anybody got a calculator? We can do some quick math here. All right, so we need 135 pounds of elemental sulfur to address the sulfur deficiency in this soil. There's, let's just go back here, and this is almost the final step. You'll see at the bottom of page 2 and all of page 3, basically, the slides are titled Maximum Yearly Application. Everybody see that? There's 5 pages of slides in this whole day's presentation, and one whole page is slides titled Maximum Yearly Application. If that gives you any idea of the significance of this basic concept here. Ready? You can overdose the system. Slow and steady wins the race. Anybody ever had too much to eat at Thanksgiving? You know that feeling? That lethargic, like, ugh. So when you figure out that your soil actually needs a few things and you start dumping it all on, your soil might get indigestion. My idea here is that slow and steady wins the race, and so there have been some fairly well, developed, safe application ranges, which means it might take 2 or 3 years to fill the tank. You can't just do it all at once, but that means you're not going to spend a whole bunch of money all at once. You're going to take some time spending that money. So the last step, as far as I'm concerned, is what's the maximum yearly application. And so for sulfur, it's generally between 50 and 100 pounds per acre. So we can deal with that later. But we'll just, I just did that one quickly so you can get the concept, and then I will go through this handout and start doing a bunch of things technically here for you. So let me see, math for minerals, the parts per million slide, I think I did that. Slide number 11, sulfur, for example. I had a theoretical suggestion that there was 25 in the soil test, but there wasn't. In this one there was 14, so we can work with that. I suggested gypsum in this one, calcium sulfate times 2H2O. Anybody who wants to understand the chemistry behind this, you can listen right now. Otherwise, if you don't care about the chemistry behind it, you can just ignore me. People want to understand how you figure out the percents, but you look at the atomic weights of the atoms in the molecule. Calcium sulfate is the technical definition of gypsum, but it's a hydrophilic compound, which means it always has waters attached. So the total atomic weight of one molecule of gypsum is 172, because you've got the calcium has atomic weight of 40, sulfur has atomic weight of 32, oxygen is 16. Do the math out, I've got it written out there. Long story short, at the end is that gypsum is 19% sulfur and 23.5% calcium. So as you'll see on page 3 and 4, I've got rough percents for various products you're normally working on. If you want to understand how you get those percents, that's how you do it. Let's do the new garden with sulfur and then with calcium. Once you do this about 3 or 4 times, you're going to get it. And you're like, oh, I can do this. So we're just going to do it 3 or 4 times until you get it. All right? So in the new garden, what's the target level of sulfur? What's the level of sulfur reported? Okay, so we're going to use gypsum instead. So what's the equation?
If you're looking just for the sulfur, you're going to take the 116 divided by the point.
0.2 or 0.1.
We can do 0.19.
Yeah, 0.19.
I see 3 people who are getting it. Everybody else is sort of following along.
That's going to give you the number of pounds you're going to need for the.
You got to slow down because everybody else is not up where you're at. I got to get everybody else to where you're at. So we're going to use gypsum instead of sulfur. So we figured out on slide number 11 that gypsum is 19% sulfur. So we're putting 0.19 down here. Everybody's following along is following along. This requires a certain level of intellectual coherence at this moment. A lot of it's more philosophical and you can sort of roll with it, but this one actually requires focus of the mind. Okay, 116 divided by 0.19 equals?
610 pounds.
610 pounds per acre of gypsum needed. All right. So we have the deficit of calcium in this product, in this field is 290 parts per million. Equals 580 pounds per acre. Yeah? 580 divided by 0.23 tells you how many pounds of gypsum would be used to address the calcium deficiency.
Sorry, where'd you get 0.23?
Same number, same slide said gypsum is 23.5% calcium and 19% sulfur. Those who are following are following. Those who are not, rapidly getting lost. I'm hoping they'll get picked up later. Yes?
In the old garden, there is more calcium found than the desired value. Is there ever a problem of having too much calcium? And how much would that be? How much would too much be?
That's a good question. Let me answer it in a second, because I'm in the middle of something right now. But I'll get right back to it, because it's an important question. Who did the math on 580 divided by 0.23? Anybody?
2,522.
2,522 pounds of gypsum to address the calcium deficiency. All right, for starters, we only need 600 pounds to address the sulfur deficiency. So we're not going to do more than 600 because we don't want to bring in an excess of sulfur. Yeah? But neither of these is the answer, because the max application per year is less than both of them. Everybody's got that? What's the max?
One more time, just that last one.
So we're thinking about gypsum as an option here, and we're saying, okay, we need 2,500 pounds of gypsum to address the calcium deficiency. We need 600 pounds of gypsum to address the sulfur deficiency. So we're never going to do more than 600 pounds because we don't want to give too much sulfur to the soil. But we're actually not even going to do 600 pounds because the max application rate per year is less than that. So you just leave it for next year, basically. Or you can add other things if you want to, depending on how sophisticated you want to get. But the max application rate for it says for sulfur with calcium needed 500 pounds per acre of gypsum. So 500 is the answer I would come up with. This is a little bit more complicated than most of the examples, so we're going to do a couple simple ones to try to bring everybody else kind of up to speed here. Yes?
I guess you would also cross-check the other chart on calcium, right? It says calcium with sulfur needed 500. Which is
I wrote them out, so they match. Yes. Gypsum, 500.
so, okay, those all work together.
Yeah. And then we'd use some limestone or whatever else to address the other calcium needs. Or we could use some more elemental sulfur to address the extra sulfur needs. Make sense? Let me just answer his question first. What do you do when you've got excess? People have heard about lead in their soil. They've heard about cadmium, people in urban situations. Anybody heard about DDT? Heard about Roundup in their soil? Heard about this? Heard about the fact that they used to be doing this nuclear testing, and they would, and the fallout, nuclear testing basically landed across North America. You've heard about the fact that we have all kinds of things in the soil we don't want to have, like too much of them. Have you heard about people that use too much compost, get elevated levels of phosphorus and zinc? Right? There's different environmental conditions will cause different excesses. My thought is that the one answer to all those problems is building the levels of life in the soil. My understanding is that microbes can digest radioactive isotopes and make them no longer radioactive but stable. Microbes can digest glyphosate, microbes can digest PCBs and dioxin, microbes can take lead and complex it and put it into double and triple bonded compounds which make it unavailable. My understanding is that microbes are intelligent and they understand when things are toxic. And the more life you have in the soil, the more able they are to digest, complex, and otherwise tie up things that are excessive. So the guy whose question I'm answering disappeared. Oh, he's put his head down. I was like, I was talking to you. Where'd you go? I didn't think I saw you get up. He's like, out of here. All right. My understanding is that for the life to function well, the basic critical environmental conditions must be met. And so I don't concern myself with excesses. I concern myself with deficiencies, thinking that if I can give them what they need to function, then they're going to take care of the stuff over time. You'll find in many cases the aluminum levels on the soil reports will be dramatically higher than you'd like. You know, you want the aluminum to be below 200. Aluminum is something that is, you know, not nice element to have in biological systems. Like some is okay, but too much is bad. You'll see over time as the biological activity increases that the aluminum level drops. You'll see it go from 1,000 to 800 to 600, you know, on an annual basis if you are doing a really good job. So the numbers will come into line. The thing is to not continue to cause excesses. If you've got something, if you've already got too much calcium, don't put more lime on. I don't care what your pH is. You've got enough calcium, don't put more lime on. You need something else perhaps, so you don't need calcium. So it's a little bit more nuanced, and some people have overdosed in this way or that way over time. So the first thing is to stop overdosing, stop making that imbalance stronger. Yes?
So you made the applications only as much as you should put on for the year. The next year is coming up, you test again.
Yes.
And would you expect the test to reflect pretty directly what you applied, or are there variations because of biology?
It is not linear. It is not linear. You can put on, 20 pounds of manganese sulfate, which equals, 7 pounds of manganese, or 3.5 parts per million, and the number jumped up 8.8 parts per million instead of 3. Some things you put more on and it stays the same. There's feedback loops going on. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, but my basic understanding is that life is way more sophisticated than linear science. and is up to all kinds of things that we don't quite understand. So, yeah, I would suggest this is a 2 or 3 year process. Every year, take a soil test, do some basic mineral balancing. By the time you're 2 or 3 years into it, most things are going to be, the tank is going to be full on most elements, and the ones that it's not full on, you're like, okay, manganese is going to be a while. So, all right, yes.
So everything you said about demobilization of excess in the soil through the carbon cycle, I agree with. Except my question is on radiologicals.
Yes.
My understanding is we can immobilize the radiologicals, but that is atomically radioactive. So I don't know of any evidence that that the soil life can actually make it no longer radioactive. It can simply. I've read his research. I didn't think he. Yes, he can immobilize, but you would have to actually change the atomic structure of the atoms in order to do that, and I have not seen that evidence yet.
We're going to talk about transmutation tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, aren't microbes capable? They're like,
That's the one thing I have not seen good science on yet.
Have you read Curvin, Louis Curvin?
I have not read that, no.
No, published right on here actually, in Nashville, I think. Yeah.
there was a guy who came up with these probiotics that he was able to spray plots of land in Fukushima, and the plot that was sprayed was radioactive free, and was growing plants that were not affected by the radiation, and everything else was.
After Chernobyl, who were compost makers and microbiologists, when the Austrian version of the USDA came in and said they were checking people's fields, checking their cabbage, checking their pasture, checking their milk for radioactive isotopes, and saying, wherever the cloud fell, if we find radiation in your crops, then you can't sell them anymore, which is what a USDA-like organization should do. Didn't happen after Fukushima. When they got to the Lubke's farm, around which all the farms radioactive isotopes were found, they couldn't find them on the Lubke's farm. So what were they up to? Yeah, I don't know. We have interesting circumstantial data. I'm going to bring up transmutation as a conversation tomorrow. My understanding is there's a lot of data that shows that microbes can play with the nucleus and put nuclei together or pull nuclei apart in a way that we are not able to.
Well, I haven't seen anything that's solid on that yet, so.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
Yeah, I think it might just be true, and the larger question about how we do the science to study these things and ask these questions is very exciting. Yes?
Reading material is beyond my experience, so if there was some way of just coming up with a list of these sources that you're talking about for the rest of us.
On our website, we have a bibliography page with dozens of books. And if you can tell me what topic area you're looking for, I can probably direct you to 2 or 3 books. How much do you really need to know in the first place is a question that I ask. Like, do I really care that much about what this person said in this book? No. Am I pretty sure about what I need to do? Yes. I'm just going to do it.
It'd be a little easier, it would be to watch an hour-and-a-half presentation on YouTube.
Yeah. And there's audio MP3s you can download and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Let's do a couple more elements on this soil report, and then we can move forward. On the old garden, let's do boron. All right, we're going to do boron slowly. Everybody's going to follow it, and then I'm going to give you your own to do. We'll do it together. What's the first step? What's the first step? People who know the answer and have already been answering, and you know what you're doing, don't answer. Those who are struggling, this is for you. Those who already got it, yes, we all know you're A students. Great, thank you. All right. Then what do we do? Okay. What's next? Which one do you do? Borax or Solubor? Borax. All right, we're doing borax. So what's the equation? How do you write it down?
was it 4.96 divided by?
4.96 divided by 0.11.
So you're taking what's needed divided by
The concentration.
concentration, all right.
Everybody's following along?
Yep.
Those who've been taking notes are feeling quite comfortable at this point. Those who didn't, starting to wish they'd written it down when they had the chance. Equals? Who's got a calculator?
45.
Yeah? All right. Is that the answer? No, it's not the answer. Max application rate per year is 30 pounds per acre. Yes.
So when we were putting down the other one, the calcium, it had other elements with it.
Yes.
Does this one have other elements with it? How do I find out that this has other elements with it that I would also be putting down and I would want to be watching?
Almost all of these things do have other elements in them that are irrelevant.
Okay. So you're going to have lists of
Hydrogens and
other
hydrogens and oxygens and carbons and things like that. There's this thing called Wikipedia,
okay.
which works really well, and you can look up anything and you can find the concentrations and all that kind of stuff. So you can look on the bag. You can see. Yeah, I would always check with your supplier. And some things are bulked out. They're pelletized, which means they've got clay added to them, which means the concentrations are lower. This is a much longer topic than the hour I'm giving it, but I'm just trying to give you the basic pieces of the puzzle so you can be an intelligent interlocutor later.
These you would suggest would be the easiest ways to put them down, but there may be other things out there or not. Should I?
The world is very broad, yes. People talk about nettles being a boron bioaccumulator, right? You could just figure out how much boron is in nettles and then get that many pounds of nettles and spread them across your field. There's homeopathic doses for things. There's energy things you can project frequencies into the environment. There's all kinds of ways of going at it. I think the physical plane is not a bad place to start. I think actually, borax is a mined material, right? It's a mined out of the ground. They sell it as soap, but it actually has 11% boron in it. My understanding is that if you start to look at what's in your various quarries around, you can probably get a lot of these elements for, 20 or 30 of them at $4 a ton from a local quarry. So actually sourcing these things locally is going to be more, more sustainable, more local, less expensive.
In powder form, like rock dust?
I'm talking about rock dust specifically, yeah. But I want to get the concept of how to do the math and equations into your heads first, and then you can take it to the next level, those of you who feel inspired. So most people can identify what these steps are. Anybody have questions about these steps? Because I'm going to give you one to do by yourself.
But don't pick a really complicated.
I'll pick a simple one.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions about what all these steps are? No. I either learned it or I didn't learn it. It's been decided already. Okay. Let's do manganese. Same field. Manganese, not magnesium. Manganese. So I have written down, I think 80 to 90 is your range. So I just chose 85. Times 2 is 170. 42 was the reported level. Times 2 is 84. I'm pretty sure 170 minus 84 is 86. Pounds per acre of manganese needed. Concentration range of manganese sulfate is 32%, so 86 divided by 0.32. I don't have a calculator. I said ballpark is 250. Tell me what the right answer is if anybody wants to. Close enough. Doesn't really matter because the max application rate is 20 pounds per acre. So 20 out of 250 is a 12.5-year process. Manganese is one of the most, is one of the elements that takes the longest time to fill the tank on if you're doing it slow and steady. If you're just using these trace elements, manganese happens to be present in a lot of our rock dusts. Green sand, if anyone's ever used green sand, is 2% manganese. Most of your basalts and granites have a good concentration of manganese. You only want to have a limited amount of manganese sulfate because it's a salt. It's soluble. It's potentially toxic if applied in large quantities. If you're putting rock dust down, you don't need to be worried about it. So there's other ways of going about doing this.
So if it's rock dust, it can exceed the maximum annual limit?
I said 20 pound, max application was 20 pounds per acre of manganese sulfate. I didn't give you a max application rate for rock dust.
Okay.
Oh, tricky. So, anyway, the rock dust conversation is probably what I should just go into in short. We've covered this math, I think, as long as I've got time to do right now. So hopefully it's gotten through to a few of you. There's a good book called The Ideal Soil. If you're into all this, it lays it all out nicely. Michael Estera. It's like an 84-page handbook. It just walks you through why organic farmers haven't been doing this, and what the history is of the movement, where this information got ignored, and who was doing what, and what the politics were. Interesting first chapter, and then it's like a handbook that just walks you through how to do this. So if you would like to learn it through that form, that's probably a pretty good one out there. I started this whole conversation off talking about the history of agriculture and river valleys. We have this thing in most places where we've got roads. People can see the road out there. It's made out of blacktop. You guys call it blacktop down here? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know what the ingredients are in blacktop? What kind of a petroleum product? Tar. And crushed rock. So the tar comes from Venezuela or Alberta. The crushed rock comes from a hole in the ground fairly close by. Doesn't make much sense to haul rock very far because most of the continent's made out of rock. So they get the rock out of a quarry. A quarry is a place where they drill a little hole, put the explosives in, blow it up, come in with a bucket loader, pick up the chunks of rock, dump them into the truck. Truck drives it over to the crusher. The crusher crushes it all up. There's these screens that pull it off. So there's a 3/4 inch screen, an 1.5 inch screen. As the rock gets to be down to certain sizes, it gets pulled off and into those different, components. There is a byproduct of this process called crusher dust, or float, or fines, which is basically exactly what is coming down the White Nile. It's finely crushed rock dust. This byproduct, there's more of it made than there is market for it. So they dump it back into the hole. So we have currently in this country hundreds of millions of tons of finely crushed rock dust distributed across the landscape, available at something like $2 a ton or $4 a ton. Basically, the amount of, what it would cost to run the loader to pick up, pick it up and dump it into a dump truck. A 22-ton dump truck will cost $50 or maybe $100 to fill. It'll cost more money to rent it to be driven across town to dump it on your land than it would cost to buy the material. So we have very locally available, in many cases, a broad spectrum of nutrients, elements that we can use if we want to. Understanding what's in your local rock dust would be helpful. Different rock dusts have different things in them. There's a whole other conversation about testing that and what's in it and matching it and doing the math and all that kind of stuff, which we can go into later if you want, or during the break if anybody's curious. Any more questions with the minerals? Quick break, and then we have a lunch break at 1:30.
So given that I'm addressing, O2, water, food, and life, how long-term of a solution is this? Is applying minerals to my soil? Like, how long will my tank stay full if I'm addressing everything?
It has everything to do with how perennial of a polyculture you're managing versus how much bare cultivation, tillage you're doing. The more of a perennial system you've got, the more generations and centuries it should be stable for. The more you're tilling the soil, destroying the ecosystem, facilitating leaching, the more you need to be topping things off on a regular basis. So yeah, once the tank is full, even if you're doing annual cropping, if you're not too destructive, you're maybe topping it off a little bit. In my world, my land is basically growing money, and I don't mind giving it a little back every year. I don't mind spending a couple $100 on various little this and that's. So as far as major amendments, I haven't done anything for years. But we'll talk more about that tomorrow, about what in-season management things are to do. Yeah, the more well-established the system is, the less you need to add. I would say a good rock dust dose every 20 years, maybe.
So what's a good rock dust? What's a maximum? What's a minimum?
10 tons per acre is a heavy dose. 2 tons per acre is a reasonable dose. A ton is 3/4 of a yard, right? A yard isn't that big. Cubic yard, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. So 2 tons is 1.5 cubic yards, which is not that much space. It sounds like a lot of weight, but it's not that much minerals actually for a whole acre worth of land. So 2 tons to 10 tons is generally a dose.
The only 2 recommendation levels that I don't see on the PowerPoint are for iron and aluminum.
Yeah.
What are those?
Iron is generally higher than you need it to be. It's supposed to be 2 to 1 iron to manganese, and generally people's iron levels are way higher than their manganese levels. So technically it would be 160 to 180 is the iron target. But if your manganese is way low, then you don't want to be dealing with iron until you get your manganese up to a balance. Aluminum should be below a 200. Generally you'll find it to be higher. The only way to get it down is to have biological activity sequester it. Yeah, good questions. Yeah. And silicon's not on there either. And silicon is above 50. 50 is a target. You want 50 or above. And rock dust is a great source of silicon.
In terms of like major incorporations, obviously if it's, depending on what it is, smaller, just top dressing or layering on the top, but are there times where when you're doing large quantities of mineralization to where you need to incorporate it into, till it in, things like that?
Yeah, so how do you get the stuff into the ground? I didn't even talk about any of that stuff yet. As far as I'm concerned, as a general principle, less disturbance is better. As I said earlier, when we started our farm, we had sort of overgrown, not even field, not even grass, it's kind of goldenrod and milkweed. So what I did was I broadcasted all the minerals that I needed before I tilled under the sod, basically. In general, when I put my minerals down these days, I don't put anything. I don't try to integrate them very much. I don't integrate them at all, actually. I've got this thing called earthworms. Do you guys have earthworms down here? Yep. Heard about them? No. Yeah, night crawlers. I like to go outside at night with my flashlight to see how much of an orgy is going on. Anybody been out for the orgy at night? Seen it? Thousands of earthworms like locked, like going at it. You ever been out there? Seen it? No? Go out at night, take a beer if you want, flashlight, and you just turn on the flashlight. And what you would like to see is an orgy. As soon as you turn the flashlight on, they all go zip, they zip back into the holes, except the ones that are fully going at it. And they don't even know, like, leave it, whatever. It don't matter, don't care if you see. My thought is, I think it's like 18 night crawlers per square yard equals your soil will be tilled 6 times in a year, equals 40,000 pounds of earthworm castings per acre, which is 1 pound of earthworm castings per square foot for free. Who needs a worm bin? Right? Your garden should be your worm bin. Your fields should be your worm bin. They should be doing their business. Like, you don't need to haul food and box them and turn them and get the liquids, and just if you take care of the soil right, they'll take care of it for you right there, right then and there. So my thought is that I broadcasted my minerals onto the ground, and they get worked in by the earthworms and whoever else, and I don't actually worry about it. So
is this not dependent upon quantity, like when you're doing these larger kind of initial?
Not depending on quantity, yeah. In general, if I'm going to be tilling, fine. You want to put them in before you till, great. But I wouldn't use. I put my minerals down as an excuse to do a deep tillage of the soil. I'd like to, if the soil's covered, if you've got grass, hay, straw, wood chips, anything like that, you probably have, and you've got moisture, you probably have earthworms and other microbes pulling things up and cycling things down. And
do you think it would be beneficial to do like a daikon or oilseed radish, wait for it to winter kill, and then apply so that it goes into, or
go for it, experiment. I generally, unless there's a really good reason, I don't want to be tilling my soil up. And I figure my experience is I just get the minerals out there and don't worry about it. They'll work their way into the system. Anybody heard about this Paul Stamets thing with he, found the world's largest living organism? Right, injected a radioactive isotope into a forest floor and found it show up ways away in real time, like speed of light, injected into the floor here, 2 miles over there, that element showed up on his sensor. The mycorrhizal hyphae are like a fiber optic cable. These elements in chemistry are like vibrations in physics. What is actually going on, how things work, it's magic. It's totally impressive. So my thought is if I create an environment in the soil where I've got that living web, living web? Huh. Then I don't need to worry about it. Then I'm not going to bother myself with too much complexity and destruction. I'm just going to let nature take care of it. I just give her what she needs and then they'll be integrated as and when. In general, I'm talking about putting rocks down, which are not soluble. This is not fertilizer, this is rocks. They need to be pre-digested by life before they're really bioavailable for the plants. So if you do make compost, a wonderful thing to do with your minerals is to put them into your compost pile when you're building it. That compost pile is like a big microbial, it's a big gut, right? And that, as it's breaking down the wood chips and the grass clippings and everything else, it'll be digesting these rocks and turning them from a crystalline form into a protoplasmic form and making them much more bioavailable. So if you are the kind of person that makes compost, figure out what your soil needs, put this compost pile is going to go in this garden, great. Put the minerals for this garden into this compost pile, and then they'll be digested and made available for your plants. I generally put the rocks down in the fall when I put my cover crops down and let that half of the year be a pre-digestion process so there's more bioavailable in the spring. If you put rocks down now or in the next month, you should not expect to get much benefit from them in the next 2 or 3 months. Maybe by September you'll see things different than they were before, but you should expect there to be a time lag because you are putting rocks in. They're not soluble nutrients, they're going straight into the plant's bloodstream. I didn't make this point earlier, but fertilizers, things that have a number on the bag, the number means soluble. So rock phosphate may be 20% phosphorus, but they can only say 3 on the bag because only 3 of those 20s are soluble. You know about that? Little secret, right? Soluble is like an IV drip. Anybody ever been to the hospital? Know people that have been to the hospital? You get fed through a soluble solution of nutrients directly into your bloodstream. Where exactly is the gut flora in that equation? There is no gut flora in the soluble nutrients in solution equation. So when you're putting down fertilizer, which means it's got a number, which means it's soluble, which means the soil life isn't used, then you are creating an environment where the plant has no incentive to take sugar and inject it into the soil. So the best way to short circuit the carbon sequestration process is to give your plants fertilizer. If you give them rocks, which they have to earn by digesting, then you sequester carbon. If you give them fertilizer, it's like putting them on an IV drip. And they're addicted to the IV drip. They need more fertilizer. They're going to die because their gut flora is atrophied.
Is the foliar feeding, does it work that same way?
Depends on what you're foliar feeding. It depends on whether you're putting soluble nutrients or not. Right? I mean, this is there's bioavailable, which is small particle size, and then there's soluble. What we want to be doing is we want to be creating an environment where our plants are able to feed our soil life and the leaf life to really, kick into a higher gear. But we do not want to be short-circuiting that digestive system process. You do not want to be adding soluble nutrients, I don't think, at all.
So like liquid fish fertilizer, you're saying that's no.
I personally said I don't add nitrogen. I think you shouldn't need to add nitrogen. If you are adding nitrogen, you're short-circuiting the digestive system process.
What about using it as a food in terms of like creating teas?
I don't make teas. It's too much work. I don't know. I guess you could do it. Yeah. I don't know. I have certain things I don't know. Did I tell you this? I worked a lot when I was a kid. I don't like working. I try to do as little as possible. I know some people like to do a lot of stuff. Like, we'll talk about it tomorrow, but basically, as soon as I get my plants in the ground, there's nothing really to do until you pick, in my little world. Right? It's July. It's hot out. Anybody ever watched the animals in the middle of the summer? Do you see them all out there in the beating down sun all day long?
Do you stake your tomatoes?
Sometimes. I definitely never prune them. But I put them 5 feet apart.
You don't sucker them or anything like
No. 5 feet apart.
And you don't sucker at all?
Absolutely not.
Can I come visit your farm?
People come all the time. They don't believe me, and then they say, "Can I see it?" I'm like, "Come on down." Yes.
I wanted to, I had already talked to the lady about getting a copy. I'm not as into the modern era with the social media and all the. I do enough to be able to do some writing on a computer, but I love books. When are you going to do your book?
I've had a book contract for 5 years, and I've had always too many things that are more important.
Yeah. Do you go for just the closest quarry, or would you try and pay attention to what the makeup of the rocks were in different quarries?
Depending on how comprehensive of a job you want to do to figure out what you need and what you don't need, you can sample rocks from multiple quarries. Generally, the basalt materials have the broadest spectrum of elements. The granites are the next best. Things like sandstone, you'd rather not touch. You look into the basic geochemistry, but in general, basalt is your best material to work with. Yeah. Let me just finish up on sea salt. I referred to sea salt before, seawater. People know about seawater, sea salt having 92 elements, all of the naturally occurring elements on the planet. In levels and ratios very similar to amniotic fluid. People heard about this one? People know about sea salt, seawater? I generally suggest a prophylactic dose of 75 pounds of sea salt per acre, per annum, full stop, east of the Mississippi. 75 pounds of sea salt per acre. I do it in my swamps, I do it in my forests, I do it everywhere on my property. Stone wall to stone wall.
Are you putting it on dry or are you?
Dry.
Your vegetables taste salty after?
They have more flavor.
Oh, really?
How much salt do you put in the soup?
A lot.
A lot?
Specific one?
The one that's probably least expensive. There's anything you've heard of probably costs too much.
Okay.
So Redmond, if they market it, it costs money to market it, so the price goes up.
It should be dirty, not the white. Yeah, right.
So yeah, I mean the one I've got is like the Kansas Salt Company, I think. Whatever. The whole middle of the country used to be an ocean, and when it dried up, they left like a 40-foot thick salt layer across the whole middle of the country, and they dig it up, and there's like a ton of it, right? I mean, many tons. So I think you can get it for like $100 a ton. So
Do you drive there with a dump truck or will they?
there was a question at some point about access to amendments, so I was going to talk about that. But when we talk about the mineral depots, yeah, setting up the infrastructure to access these things. Once you understand what you need, then you have to figure out how to get it, and then finally you get it actually onto the ground, which is many years worth of.
Salt is toxic to the, I mean, you don't put salt in it. That's what they did in, what was it, Carthage?
The Carthaginians? Yeah. I think the Romans salted the Carthaginians' field. So how much salt do you put in the soup? Just enough for the flavor to come together. 75 pounds per acre is not a lot.
So how often do you do that?
Per annum, every year.
Every year.
How many years have you been
What kind
doing
of salt
that?
is this?
Sea salt, as inexpensive as possible.
Inexpensive as possible?
Unless you want to spend more money. You can use Himalayan salt if you want, but
You avoid the anti-caking. Sometimes they treat it with this anti-caking substance that makes
generally the least expensive stuff has the least stuff added to it. So my Kansas rock salt left in the basement of the barn over the winter basically sucked up a bunch of water from the atmosphere and is now pretty well caked. Yeah, even though it was in plastic bags. So
non-demineralized, because a lot of those salts are demineralized.
you get the raw, straight stuff from the ground. They didn't do anything to it except dig it up and put it in a bag. That's going to be your least expensive and your least toxic and your most 300 million year old sea salt was long before Fukushima was polluting the Pacific, right? There's no toxins in there, and it costs way less than C90 and Redmond and all that kind of stuff. So in general, I think systemically between rock dust and sea salt, we have the naturally occurring materials in massive quantities necessary to remineralize this planet. I'm not sure if anybody else has been to the developing world. It's referred to as the developing world now. It used to be called the third world. Have you seen places where people were starving to death? The land is worn out, and they were moving to the cities to sell their daughters into prostitution to stay alive because that was the only option. Anybody been to that part of the world? You've seen what life is like for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people? I suggest between rock dust and seawater, we have the minerals necessary to revitalize these lands that haven't been glaciated for millions of years, that in many cases are totally worn out. We don't need anything fancy. We don't need anything expensive. We don't need any big industry stuff. It can be totally local, natural, really inexpensive stuff that can be used to systemically revitalize this planet. You give me the US military budget for Afghanistan for a month, and I'll remineralize India. Right? I mean, we're talking about totally doable, really plausible strategies here for revitalizing this planet and shifting the dynamics in culture and climate and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, thank you very much.
Are you tractor spreading? Are you hand spreading? How are you?
It depends. 5-gallon buckets under the arm, tractor bucket, dump stuff on the tractor cart. Everybody's driving along. Everybody's whipping out shovelfuls this way and that way. Whatever you got for infrastructure and staff, and get it out there. You can think about it and think about it and think about it and think about it, and it doesn't matter until you get it out there. So just get it out there. I got an old tractor cart. We take bucket loads of the rock dust, dump it on the tractor cart. One person's driving the tractor, 3 people on the tractor with shovels. One's whipping this way, one's whipping that way, one's whipping out the back.
Do you need to be watering it like as you do it?
No.
So if it's
just
not
get it
gonna
out
rain
there.
Anytime soon, you're not worried about it.
It'll rain eventually. If the minerals aren't present, get them present. Keep it real simple. Just get them out there, and then nature will cycle it through. Right? This is all we're doing is just getting this critical environmental component present. You can make it real fancy if you want and spend a lot of money and spend a lot of time.
Is that true as well? So like mycorrhiza is symbiotic, and you have endo, ecto, and ericaceous or whatever. The idea is that do you recommend inoculating mycorrhizal fungi into soil? Is that something?
We're talking about inoculation after lunch. Yes, I was gonna take a break before we had lunch in an hour, and we're running out of time for a break and then more talking. So it's 12:30 right now. Can we take a 10-minute break and reconvene?